for the
Good
Pod
questions,
20?
by the way. You are good.
It's okay.
Yeah.
A bit different to Dom Jolly, but
yeah,
still.
I know.
Charlie Webster is a television presenter that you may have seen on Sky Sports, or hosting all sorts of sporting events on various channels on the telly, including the Goodwood Festival of Speed, the Red Bull Air Race, the Speedway Grand Prix. She also talks about breaking sports news and social topics on shows including Football Focus, Good Morning Britain. And Charlie has worked with victims of domestic and sexual abuse for many years. She's a victim herself and sits on an independent panel which advises the government. Charlie's spoken at number 10 Downing Street and in Parliament about how the justice system fails victims. She hosts a podcast called Undiscussable. Charlie Webster, welcome to the Zoomcast.
Thank you. What an introduction.
Well, I thought, for anyone who didn't know, they needed to get a well-rounded appreciation of who you are and what you do.
That was good. I was like, oh yeah, I did do that. That was great fun.
So tell us about the podcast then, because this means a lot to you. Because you've produced it as an independent. So this is something clearly very, very close to your heart. So tell us all about it.
Yeah, you know how it started was as you just mentioned in the introduction, I've been advising the government as an independent on a panel called the Victims Panel. And I've been doing that for about, oh my gosh, coming over 5 years now. And then the domestic abuse bill was developed. And so I kept going in and talking about how I felt the system failed victims across the board. Now, when I'm talking about victims, I'm talking about women, I'm talking about men, I'm talking about people in the LGBTQ community, I'm talking about children, I'm talking about BAME, I'm talking about any ethnicity, any gender, any sexual orientation and ability. It's really important that we talk about victims as a whole. And I was just getting ridiculously frustrated because I felt like people were speaking up and speaking about it, yet nobody was listening. And I mean, like, they were hearing what I was saying, but they weren't listening. And then we saw the same thing happen over and over and over again. And you know what, we're seeing it right now, Graham, because nothing is changed and nothing is being done about it. At the moment, we're currently in lockdown due to the coronavirus, and deaths to domestic abuse have doubled. Calls to helplines are around 50% more now. So this is something that hasn't changed. And so the Undiscussable was born out of frustration and not feeling like people really understood what was going on. And I remember saying to a friend of mine who's also a child survivor of domestic abuse, and I was like, what can I do? What can I do? And she's a massive lover of podcasts. And she was like, well, you really should do a podcast. And I was like, oh yeah. And then I'm the type of person that when I say I'm going to do something, I'm like a dog with a bone. I almost annoy myself. Like I'm that, I don't know, tenacious with things, and I can't let things go. So I just went in a complete mission to try and not just give victims and survivors a voice, but also to try and help the general public understand what domestic abuse is, why it affects everyone and how important it should be to everyone, but also to help people understand and to highlight how the government and the system is massively failing victims, survivors, children, our communities and our society. So that's how it started, basically. And also the thing I realized was that I work with so many victims and survivors, and they trust me, and I can give them they're an opportunity to tell their story in a safe and trusted environment because I understand.
So what is domestic abuse? I'm guessing it's a spectrum, obviously.
That's a really good question, actually, because we don't understand it. So what domestic abuse is not how the media portray it. It's not an argument. It's not a big, aggressive man giving a cowering, weak female a black eye. That's not what domestic abuse is. Domestic abuse is about power and control, and then the perpetrator does everything once they have the power and control to maintain the power and control. So they use any means possible, whether that's through financial control, through emotional control, through sexual control, through control of children, through violence, or through emotional abuse. So it's about using those different behaviors to control somebody, and using isolation as well. Like a perpetrator often very slowly and subtly gets rid of anybody that can empower that victim.
So are there victims who don't even know they're victims?
I'd say the majority of victims don't really know they're victims until they're out of the situation, until it gets so bad. The reason being is not the victim's fault. It tends to be because perpetrators are extremely subtle. So for example, like, bear with me, if you and me went on a date, right, you know, we'd have a nice time. And if you leant over the table and physically hurt me, right, I would walk away straight away, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, this guy is horrific, and I'd call the police. Okay. And you know, I'm talking about me and you, but I'm talking about any relationship and any sexual orientation. Now, if we got to know each other and you really charmed me, and you were so kind and you were so lovely, and you know, maybe I was about to go and see a friend, but you said, no, stay in with me tonight, I really want to spend more time with you. And I'd be like, oh, that's so lovely, that's so romantic. And that's how it starts. And then very subtly forms of control come in without you even realizing it. You might not even realize that the person's trying to control you by trying to stop you from seeing other people around you. Then once you're in that situation, once you're isolated, once you rely on that person, all of a sudden you realize that your dependency has kind of disappeared and gone. And then how do you get out of that situation? Because also you love that person. So it's very, very complex.
And people do seem to stay with them. And you did an episode called Why Do They Stay? Why do they stay with people once they realize that this is wrong?
Because it's very, very hard to leave. And it's, you know, that's the reason why we named that episode, Why Don't They Just Leave? Because I think it's one of the most common questions. And it's, you know, it's not the general public's fault. Because actually you're like, oh my God, why don't you just leave? And you go back to the example I just gave you. If you did that to me in a restaurant and I didn't even know you, then I wouldn't go anywhere near you. But that's the thing, is they do know that person. They're spending their life with their person. They spend all that time with their person and they make excuses for that person because they love that person. But the thing is, the perpetrators are extremely clever, and it's not as simple as just leaving. I mean, for example, I'll use my own family. There was control via finances. So, you know, if my mum or a victim left, then they had nothing. They'd be completely homeless.
This was your stepfather, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so if a victim wants to try and leave, there's a lot of financial control around it. So a lot of victims leave with nothing. Me and my mum left with 2 little bags and less than £50. You know, it's not that easy. A lot of victims, all their family and friends have been cut off, so they have nowhere to go. Even going to refuges, the refuges turn victims down all the time, every single day, because there isn't enough room. So where are they supposed to go? On the street or back into a dangerous situation? Also, there's hardly any refuges for men. So where do men go? Again, there's very hardly any safe places for people in the LGBT community to go. But also, when a victim leaves is actually the most dangerous time. So that's when we often see, you know, deaths, sadly, is when the person's trying to leave. And the reason why is because when the perpetrator feels like they are losing control and they've lost the control, that's when they're at their most dangerous, because they will do anything to control that person, including killing them and killing themselves, which is what we've seen happen a lot during this lockdown, but that was happening a lot beforehand. I mean, I'll use the stat of women. 2 to 3 women are killed every week in England and Wales alone at the hands of their partner or ex-partner. And that tends to be when they're trying to leave the situation. So there's so much more to understand that. And, you know, in the episode called Why Don't They Just Leave, we explained that. We explained it from a female and a male point of view. I mean, there was one male in my podcast who he tried so many times, and he did actually leave, but she wouldn't leave him alone. She even spread around the community that he was a child sexual perpetrator. And he went to the police so many times, and the police were like, oh, look, it's just an argument. It's just an argument. I mean, she attacked him from behind in the middle of the street. So it is not as simple as just leaving, because even often when they do leave, they still aren't left alone. And then also they use children as a form of control as well, because the perpetrator will try and get custody of the children to make sure that the victim stays with them or goes back to them. So it's so complex. It's really important we understand that.
So are they trying to manipulate society's values to try and justify what they're doing with they call it gaslighting, don't they? When they lie, they change history and all the rest of it. Is that how it works?
Yeah, I think a perpetrator often probably doesn't even see themselves as a perpetrator. They see themselves as a victim. They blame everybody else. Are
they narcissists?
Yeah. Very, very narcissistic. Because if you think of it as a perpetrator, it's very, very hard for them to look inside themselves, right? And see the behaviors that they're doing. So for example, like, my stepdad just blamed everyone else. He blamed everyone else. He blamed my mom. He blamed us, me and my siblings. He blamed everybody around him.
What was he blaming you for?
He blamed me for scheming against him since I was a child, to try and take my mum away from him. But actually, what tends to happen is it's the reverse thing. So whatever that perpetrator is saying, and I used he because of my stepdad, to me or to the victim, is because that's what they're doing to themselves.
They call it projection, don't they?
Yeah. So
yeah,
it's like, you made me do it. You made me do it. Or, I mean, gosh, he used to hate me and my mum talking because he felt really jealous. And, if me and my mum spoke, then he wasn't part of it. And he hated that.
Well, you had the double whammy, though. You weren't only suffering the emotional abuse from domestic abuse, you were also sexually abused by a running coach as well. What happened there?
Yeah, I was sexually abused by my running coach. And that's another thing that I suppose we need to talk about in a way, because it is all linked to domestic abuse. I mean, it's no coincidence that I was sexually abused as a teenager, because I was groomed. And that's what, again, something we look at sexual abuse maybe as a violent act that happens one-off in a dark alley. And that's very, very rare. 90% of victims trust and know their perpetrator. And my running coach abused me, but I knew him probably like coming up to 3 years before he actually physically did anything to me. And in that entire 3 years, it was almost like, the best way I can describe it was almost like, we watch documentaries sometimes about cults and how the mental manipulation happens and brainwashing. That's almost what grooming is like, because my coach got so much into my head that when he actually first did something to me, I was really confused. I didn't understand what it was, because the whole time, when he first physically did the act, I think I was around 14 and 15. So I was.
But he'd been grooming you since you were much, much younger.
Yeah, so I started training with him at 12.
Right.
But he smiled at me, reassured me, looked me in the eye, like I'm looking you in the eye, and smiled while he was doing it like that, and told me how this is the best thing for me to help me win races. It's very confusing as a child, because if you look at the social cues of my face, if I'm doing that to you and I'm talking to you like this, Graham, you're going to be like, whoa. But if I'm saying things like this to you and smiling, you're going to be kind of like, okay, this is really confusing. Is this person doing something bad to me, or are they not doing something bad to me? Because they're actually smiling at me, telling me this is for my own benefit. And also, I desperately wanted to win races. I was good. I was representing my county. I was representing, England. And I wanted to be the best because I believed that if I was the best, it was a way of escape. It's a way that I could get out of my situation. But also it'd be a way that I was utterly convinced that then, you know, maybe my stepdad would be nice. Maybe he would love me because then I've proved that I am good enough, because I've proved that I'm worth something. And then maybe my mum would pay attention because then she'd be like, oh my gosh, you know, she is worthy because she's winning races, you know. So this is what goes on in a child's head.
Yeah.
Because
so there was something missing there that you needed to feel validated.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so you thought the running and the achieving and the winning would do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I didn't feel good enough as an individual myself, because I was told I wasn't good enough.
How has that affected you? And I ask this question because you work in media, and media is known, and not unfairly, by the way, for being quite brutal to people in media. And if you haven't got a thick skin, you don't last very long. And people who seem to gravitate towards show business and media and journalism and all the rest of it and being in the public eye do tend to have something missing and seek some kind of external validation to feel complete as human beings. But how was your experience being abused by someone you really trusted, a coach? I mean, he went to jail for 10 years. I mean, it was a serious thing that he did, and there must have been other cases. But also having the abuse at home as well. How did that affect you in an environment? And you were a sports presenter in what can be a male-dominated field. How did that affect you every day? I don't mean on the air, I mean off the air, dealing with the kind of stuff that people in broadcasting have to deal with.
I absolutely love that you've asked this question. I love, right? Because I've thought about this a lot. Because to start with, if I'm really honest, and I don't think I'd be able to say these things like, say, 5 years ago. I've done like a lot of work on this. In the early days, I think I pushed so hard for my career because I wanted to prove that I could do something extraordinary. You know, because when I first started my career, I mean, I never worked with a woman, ever. There weren't any women at all. And there definitely weren't any working class women, or hardly any working class people. So it wasn't just about my gender. It was also about where I was from. So I was, you know, I'm from a very poor family as well. So my mum had me as a teenager, you know, and so to kind of double up the domestic abuse, we also had nothing. So, and people where I was from, I was told, this is absolutely not the case, but I was told as a child, didn't amount to anything and weren't anything. So I think it was like this twofold thing where I was like, you know, somebody from a poor background, you know, I was the first person in my family to be educated, to get an education ever in the whole generations. So I think I had this like a massive chip on my shoulder. If I'm really honest, I did. I had like one an ear.
In a way, though, in a bizarre way, it probably helped you though, because you have to be tough to get on in the business you're in.
Yeah, it did. It did definitely help me because you know, one of my friends at university described me. I've been writing a book and I asked her what she thought. And she described me at university, because I did go to university against all odds. I got a full-time job as a personal trainer and fitness instructor. I used to go to university lectures in my training kit, run to the gym, teach a class, go back to a lecture. Oh my God, I don't even think I slept. And I worked so hard and I was so determined, because the thing about people that were brought up like me, there's no safety net. There's no safety net. So you rely entirely on yourself.
Can't fall back on daddy's money.
No. I mean, yeah, or anything. Like I knew that if I didn't look after myself, I would fall. So I was my own caretaker. So I worked so hard, and I saw running as my way out. And then once my coach got put in jail, I couldn't run anymore. It destroyed me. So that escape, that way out disappeared. So then I was like, well, where am I supposed to go? Where am I supposed to live? At the time I was living with my nan and granddad. What can I do? So I was like, well, oh my God, if I go to university, it means I have another 3 years to figure this out. I can get an education, get a degree, which nobody else has. So I was like, I'm going to get a degree because nobody else has one in my family, sorry. And also it gave me accommodation. It gave me 3 years of accommodation because I wouldn't have had anywhere to live. So that was, it was kind of the answer to me. But going back to your question, so initially it was all this, like, it was out of determination. So yeah, going back to what I was saying, my friend described me as, you know, I've got your back. I'm extremely loyal. You can come along for the ride, but, you know, if you don't go in my path, then bye, type thing. That's what my friend described me as. So I wasn't horrible in any way, but I was very, 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 very determined. And I was never going to waver off that path. And I also found it very difficult to trust people. And because of that, my relationships, both intimate and with friends, only went so far. So I had a lot of friends because, you know, I was good fun. I was a good ear to talk to. I went out all the time. I burnt the candle massively. You know, I was very kind of extroverty in my behavior, but inside I was an introvert inside. And so you were allowed to kind of come this far up to me. So, you know, but then there'd be a big barrier that you weren't allowed to step over. But you know what? It actually caused me a lot of damage. So, you know, we were saying about how it was a good thing in the sense of my career because it made me very, very thick-skinned. You know, nothing anybody could ever say to me was as bad as what used to happen to me at home. Nothing, or what used to happen to me by my running coach. So none of it bothered me. None of it fazed me because, you know what? I was almost used to it. And it was almost comfortable for me because it was more uncomfortable for me to be in a situation where it was nice because it made me very nervous about it because I suspected that, you know, well, this isn't safe because if somebody's being nice, it means something's about to happen. And it's really common with people that are brought up in abuse. It's something I've been speaking about on social media. In fact, I try and help people in my podcast, Undiscussable. I was part of a trauma group for 2 years. It's really, really common for kids that are brought up in that situation to find situations of safety as an adult, including intimate relationships, very, very scary. And that's what happened to me. And that's how I was almost like a horse with blinkers on. I could just push. I didn't care what anybody thought. I didn't care if people thought a woman shouldn't do this. It was like putting a red rag to a bull. I'd just prove them wrong. For example, I was the first woman in the world to host boxing and host a heavyweight world title fight. You know, the first time I walked into that office to ask if I could get involved in boxing, I was told that a woman couldn't do boxing. I was told that an audience wasn't ready for a woman to be involved in boxing. Do you know what that said to me?
What?
It said, go and prove us wrong.
Yeah.
So I did.
Yeah.
But then the problem was when I achieved that goal, then I had to achieve another goal.
Okay.
And that's something I needed to change because I never felt like it was good enough. I always felt like I was a failure. Always.
And relationships with bosses, how'd they go? Because, you know, media has had its fair share of narcissists and sociopaths. How did you get on with, at the highest level, with some of those people without naming any names or giving any clues?
Okay, how am I going to do this? Yes, you are right. That's my first answer. One boss used to call me an enigma. Oh, she's an enigma. Because he used to say that he could never work me out. And that used to unnerve him because he made a lot of people cry and a lot of women cry, and he bullied them. And with me, it really did affect me, by the way. This doesn't mean things don't affect me. It's just because of the environment I was brought in, I was very, very good at controlling my emotions. And one of the behaviors that children brought up in situations like me or have experienced abuse of any form can be detachment. So I was very, very detached. It's called detached protector, basically. It's a maladaptive behavior or an unhealthy behavior in psychology where we switch our emotions off to protect ourselves, which is really, really useful in situations of danger, but it's not useful in day-to-day life.
It's a survival technique.
Yeah. So, which is great because like I'm the best survivor in the world when it comes to danger, but I struggled on a day-to-day because that that behavior isn't normal, and it's not, you know, I can't, you know, form a good relationship with you, for example, if I'm emotionally detached. I can't form a good relationship with friends or intimate people if I'm emotionally detached all the way and all the time and not showing vulnerabilities, because the way we have human connection is through vulnerability, through trust and through vulnerability. So when it came to bosses, I didn't show emotion. They could, you know, I remember one of them saying to me that, I remember going on a show, I'm trying not to name things, a show to talk about domestic abuse, actually. And I went on that show and spoke about domestic abuse. And then that show wasn't my normal job. Then I went back to my normal job. And the next day, and it was in the papers that I, you know, had been speaking about domestic abuse. And it was very complimentary about what I was saying in the papers. And then I got told that because of the way I look, this is by the boss, that nobody will ever take me seriously. So how stupid do I think I am by doing something like that? And then I went on air.
Oh, this was just before you went on air?
Oh, yeah, because that's what they used to do.
Good pep talk.
Yep. But you're right, that it happens, and it's quite sick, but it happens a lot in this industry. And I think things are really changing for the better. But it needs to be really stamped out. And again, it's, in a way, it's like a domestic abuse because it's a form of control. So that boss is trying to control you. It's very, very, very similar to how domestic abuse works. But the thing is, I'm used to people like that. I was brought up with people like that. And that's why he used to call me Enigma, because I didn't break. He couldn't break me. I used to go to the toilet and cry, you know, but I would never do it in front of him. Whereas everybody else, he would manage to break them in front of them. And so, you know, he found me difficult, and I found him very, very difficult. But, you know, at the same time, I think it triggered me a lot because it made me stay in that situation for a long time, because I was almost trying to prove that I was good enough to be in that situation. But, you know, now I would never, ever tolerate that behavior. And I absolutely did tolerate that behavior. I didn't stand up to it. I didn't go, no, this is unacceptable, this is wrong. Because also the problem with those situations is you're taking down a massive, massive company. Mm-hmm. You know, it is an individual, which a lot of individuals can't do, and it will absolutely destroy them and destroy their career. And they don't have the financial capability like these big companies do, or these people do. But I did absolutely tolerate it. I just got on with it and just tried to do everything to prove them wrong, which I would never do now, because that made me realize that that was always my behavior from a young child, was constantly trying to prove myself. And then ultimately you're never going to be happy. And I realized that. But
some people
only
say,
about 4 or 5 years ago.
Some people say that, you know, men like that treat women like that, it is a result of the way that women are objectified, and, you know, we're bombarded with images of women in various stages of undress. How responsible do you think the media are for what happens to female victims?
So I think that viewpoint is really interesting, but also I think it gives men a really bad reputation. Now,
I've always thought that when people say that, I always say, people go, look, that's offensive to women. I go, that's actually offensive to men. I agree. You know, I think it shortchanges what men are, and
100%.
And makes men very two-dimensional.
Yeah, and I think it's a very old-fashioned way of looking at things, and I don't think it works. Looking at things like that has never changed anything.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I always think, well, my God, I mean, I have 3 brothers. They're not like that.
Yeah.
You know, and gosh, I am somebody that, let me tell you, can say this because I've been abused by multiple men, you know, so, but I do not think men are like that. 100%. I think an abuser is an abuser. It's their behavior, not their gender.
What makes them an abuser then? What is it is it their background, or is it nature or nurture?
I 100% believe that it's nurture. Interestingly, I did a study at university on this. Probably another thing that was because of my background, but it's definitely nurture. I don't believe anybody is born bad. I believe you can be born and then you can end up in a situation of severe trauma.
Is it a classic case of a lack of positive role models for these people?
Yeah, a lot of the time it's a lack of So there is definitely a cycle of, for example, one of the episodes is about this, of Undiscussable. I'm just trying to remember which one it was, which number it is. I think it's number 4, 3 or 4, and it's called Raising a Perpetrator. And all the young lads in this project, so I spoke to the guy that runs the project, who's a mentor for the project. He's a young lad himself. He was only in his mid-20s. Every single young lad that they work with, 11 to 18, and they're seen as kind of having harmful behaviors, right? Every single one of them, and I'm talking things to sexist remarks up to rape. Yeah. So it's severe. Every single one of them has been a victim of domestic and sexual abuse. So that's really important that we look at the link. And it's not saying that, I was brought up in that situation and I'm not a perpetrator.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But so it's not saying that everybody brought up in those situations or that was a victim as a child will end up as an abuser or a perpetrator. What it's saying is the majority of abusers and perpetrators have been victims of some form. And if you think about it as a child, if you're in that situation, it was the same that was missing. The same thing that was driving me in my career was the same thing. It's a way. You've got to try and find some value. You've got to try and find some worth. You've got to try and find some form of control, because everything feels out of your control, right? When you're brought up in that situation, when you are a victim. And also when you're a victim of domestic abuse, I don't think I've met anybody who was brought up in that situation that didn't have self-worth and self-esteem problems or mental health problems, where they suffered depression. So if you look at what that child is taught, a child brought up is taught how to love themselves and how to love other people through what they are see and what they are shown in their family. So if they're brought up in a situation without love, where they're not valued, they don't feel love, then what do we expect adults to become? And so often that's the situation that we see, and that so often, we see that cycle. And I know a lot of perpetrators, if you look back through their history, there's been some form of abandonment by either a mother or a father, some form of abuse and some form of neglect.
I brought up the women in the media deliberately, probably unfairly, because you posed for FHM. Yeah. What drove that decision?
That's a good question as well. So, firstly, what's the difference between David Beckham posting in his boxer shorts and the difference between me being on FHM? By the way, in an era when that's what happened.
Yeah.
So now we don't have those magazines, right?
Yeah, this was 2013, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And I think you'd done some other modelling about it. Was probably 10 years before that too, wasn't it?
Oh my gosh, yeah. You know what? And I am proud of everything I've done. I modelled throughout university because it also helped me pay for my education. And I don't know to explain why, because we've already gone there. So I had a full-time job, and my full-time job did not even pay for my university fees. My full-time job paid for me to live, to eat, and I worked full-time. I'm not talking part-time, full-time, teaching classes and personal training people. So I also modeled on the side. I was a survivor. I am a survivor. I'm not stupid. I knew how I could earn money, and I needed money. I had nothing and no support. I modeled.
That was at the very beginning. But in 2013, when you did FHM, you were on Sky Sports, Sky Sports News.
Yeah, but so was everybody else who'd also done it. So was Kirsty Gallagher. And Sky, at the time, also did their own adverts like that. Sky have an advert of Kirsty, who's a wonderful woman, also in scantily clad or partly naked situation. That's how Sky advertised it at the time. Remember, this was an era where those things happened, and I do not understand why, if you are a woman who is deemed as attractive. I'm not saying, you know, I'm any different from anybody else, but is deemed as attractive to model. You know, Cara Delevingne, she models. You know, Heidi Klum, they're absolutely stunning people, strong women who have intelligence. So I do not understand
did that make
why.
it more? Did that make, after you'd done that, did it make it more difficult in a male environment like a news sports broadcaster for you to be taken seriously? Did it actually?
But let me reverse the question. Why
Okay.
does that mean that you aren't taken seriously?
Oh, I can't see. You're absolutely. When you made the
Because
point
why
about
does that
David Beckham in
mean?
his underwear, I mean, if they had
Yeah.
any of the male Sky Sports guys in their underwear, it would have been laughed off as a bit of a, oh, look, this is
But
an
they were.
interesting. Yeah.
But they were in
Yeah.
men's fitness. They
Yeah.
were. They
Yeah.
were. They
Yeah.
were down to their boxes. But nobody ever comments about that. And also, many women also drool over attractive men. We see it all the time.
We're only human. Yeah.
You know, and I'm not saying that, you know, like for example, if I got asked to do that now, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it because I've done it. I don't feel the need to do it. But the fact that I have to, because I'm a woman, I have to constantly prove credibility is absolutely nonsense, because that just falls into the sexist trap again.
Yeah.
And, you know, the women that were like, oh no, we can't do anything. You know, we have to dress in suits. We have to, oh my God, we have to do this to try and get any type of credibility. It's absolutely goddamn stupid.
Well, it is, because men and women are not the same, and you don't get equality by turning women into men. That's not what it's about. It's about
and when the same channel that I was at when I did that also told women they had to dress a certain way and act like women, because I used to turn up at that channel in my training kit, because I used to cycle and run to work, and I got told off and told that I should look like a woman should and not turn up in my training kit. However, the men that turned up in their training kit got applauded.
Okay.
So I think it's very, very hypocritical.
Yeah.
And I think it's very important that, you know, that doesn't mean that that person doesn't have credibility and doesn't have knowledge and doesn't have intelligence.
Yeah. So I was just wondering, in case there was, you know, you said you did the running because you wanted to achieve, you wanted to be approved and get validation, whether there was any of that in your decision to do the FHM thing as well. Had anybody told you that you weren't, you know, good enough looking to be one of those things? And was there any of that going in there? Could that possibly have been, you know, with your background, a reason why?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my gosh, to be honest, like when I was younger, I didn't for a second think that I could do anything like that, you know. And actually, when I went to university and I started modeling, that's only when I realized that I was like, because I got asked to do some modeling and I was like, oh. And then I was like, oh. And all I saw it as was a way to fund myself to get out of my situation. That's all I saw it as. And actually, you know what? I had a great laugh. And remember, I didn't know anybody at all. And it was a great way to get contacts. You know, I moved to London straight from university and signed straight up to a model agency. And it was an amazing way to start to get to know people. I knew no one. I had no contacts, no connections, like nothing. So it was an amazing way to start getting contacts, to start networking with people, to start building a portfolio. It also gave me money so I could live in London. I couldn't live on London on what I was earning. No way. But yeah, I think going back to the FHM question, probably. And to be honest, like when I did it, I didn't think there was anything wrong with doing it. You know, if I thought it was going to get a backlash and it was going to affect my career, then I wouldn't have done it. But nobody said otherwise, including the channel that I worked for, who knew exactly what was going on. So they just used people as bait. So that, you know, I think, you know, when I was brought up as a kid, I was definitely told that I wasn't good enough and told I was called stupid and I was called ugly and I was called that every day as a child. And, you know, it definitely has an effect on you. And that probably somewhere in the back of my mind, you know, was fueled by that. And that's why it's so important. I mean, if there is anybody listening to this that can relate to my situation, that's why it's so important to get help and actually work through trauma. And because it makes you realize that even though you're out of maybe that dangerous situation, that the perpetrator can live for a long time in your own head and become your own critic, and can really make you unhappy because it tells you, you know, that you're not good enough. And if things don't go right, then it's like, see, I told you you weren't good enough. And I think a lot of people can relate to that.
The Undiscussable podcast, it is incredibly intimate. You even had your mum on. Tell us about that.
Yeah, to be honest, I was surprised that she said yeah to start with. But one of the other reasons, going back to the very first question you asked me about why I decided to do this and why I decided to make it as an independent as well, was because my mum left my stepdad at the same time. And I felt for the first time that I didn't have to hide, because for so long people didn't know.
Was your mum aware of what was going on and how you were feeling?
As in,
at the time when it was all going on with your stepdad?
Probably yes and no, because don't forget, at the time it was very, very heightened stress. It was dangerous as well, and there's a lot in there that I haven't talked about and I don't feel comfortable talking about yet because of how it involves other people, and it's very, very distressing. There was a lot more that happened that was extremely, extremely dangerous. But I feel like maybe also it was a way of me coping at the time, when I was trying to help my mum and trying to sort things out. I'm kind of like I'm the eldest of the family, and I'm the person that I just go into kind of like parent mode, I suppose, where I try and sort everything out and take care of everyone. It's very much what I'm like, and that's kind of the role I've played my entire life, really, which I suppose is another reason I did Undiscussable, because I feel like it can help people, and I feel a real great duty to do that. I really, really do. And when I first told my mum what I was doing, she kind of was like, okay. And then that was it. And then I asked her, you know, to say a few things on tape. And that was in episode 5. And that was at the time when we'd found my mum a safe place to be. And things were still horrific at the time. And my mum was
So it was
also
quite recent to the events that you made that
It
podcast.
was during the time, yeah.
Wow.
I know, yeah. Yeah, so when she speaks to me in episode 5 for the first time, that was when things were happening at the same time. So my mum had just left him and he was threatening her and her life and me, and she was in a safe place. And obviously I recorded this, but I had no intention of releasing it until I knew that it was okay to release it, until it was safe. And I just wanted to see if she wanted to say anything. Because at the time she was also dealing with it in her own head about, you know, she had a lot of guilt, and also about what her life was and what had happened. Because, you know, even for her, it took her a long time to realize how bad it was. And you know, because the way to cope with things is to just do this, is to kind of stick your head in the sand and try not to accept or realize what life all of a sudden is, you know. And I think, again, a lot of victims will relate to that. It took my mum time to really realize, and it's hard to go, yes, I've spent a huge amount of my life being abused. It's hard to say that. It's hard, you know, because that realization hurts. And
well,
then
a lot of victims blame themselves, don't they, in some way? They think it was something that they did that brought it on.
Yeah, but society also blames them. Society fuels that. Society hands that on a platter to a perpetrator, because a perpetrator uses that, because a perpetrator uses that.
In what way?
In the sense that if a victim feels like it's their fault and it's their own shame, they're less likely to leave.
I see. Right. Okay. Yeah.
So that's why we need to change that by society, because if they feel like they're going to be judged and re-victimized by society, as well as being a victim by their own perpetrator, then it's very, very hard to leave that situation. And also, perpetrator will say that it is their fault because they're not good enough, because they didn't do this. So the messages that society gives is also the same message the perpetrator gives. So if the victim is hearing it from both the perpetrator and society, then the victim will believe it.
Right.
So it's really, really important that we don't do this and we give an opposing message to the perpetrator, because many victims do blame themselves. I mean, my mom still does to an extent.
So what needs to change then, Charlie? What needs to happen? What does this society have to do to stop this, which is on a massive scale here, isn't it, as well?
Yeah. We're not talking about minority.
Yeah. What needs to change here?
There's multiple things. It's kind of a multifaceted approach, really. And just to reiterate what you just said, it isn't a minority. That's firstly what we need to get rid of. It's not a minority. It's actually a majority. We're speaking to the majority, not the minority. So I'll start with maybe like a society approach. So as a society, we need to really understand what domestic abuse is and who domestic abuse affects. So it affects everyone, firstly. So it doesn't just affect women or white women that are working class or whatever the perception is. It affects all ethnicities, all genders, all sexual orientation, children, elderly, middle-aged, young, whatever. It just affects everyone. And that's something that we still don't understand as a society. So that needs to change. We also need to stop blaming victims, like we just talked about, as a society. So there needs to be an educational change across society to understand that domestic abuse, the foundation of it is about control and power. Because as soon as we understand that, then we go, oh, yes, that's why. And then we understand that actually even when a victim tries to leave, then they're also risking their life. And we've seen multiple deaths. So it's not as simple as a victim just leaving. And we've seen deaths of children happening right now. So we really need to blow it out of the water as society and start talking about it.
Right. So it's an awareness thing, because it is something that people don't like to talk about.
It makes us feel uncomfortable.
We have to talk about it. Yeah.
Oh, it's uncomfortable. But you know what? While we don't talk about it, we allow it. We are allowing it by keeping it, using that really old phrase, behind closed doors, or it's just a domestic. While we still see it as that, we are enabling it. So as a society as a whole, education and perception needs to change, which is one of the reasons why I did Undiscussable, because originally it was like made by survivors, me and my friends, for survivors, but actually it's also for the general public to understand what it is. And then from a government system approach, there needs to be mandatory police training, because there isn't. So
right,
a lot
so
of
they
police,
don't see it. Okay, right.
Yeah, so I'm not blaming police. I'm blaming the people that made the decisions above, because I know police are under immense pressure. And, they also, remember, police are a cross-section of society. So they bring their own views to it. Yeah. So, if they open the door and walk in the house, they immediately think it's the woman. What if it was the man that's the victim? It was somebody in my podcast, the police came and they spoke to the woman. The man had just been attempted to be strangled and was behind the bathroom door, hardly breathing. But the police didn't check on him because they thought it was the woman. So, that's why it's so important we understand what it is. And also, if the police walk in the door and the woman, let's say it's a woman or a victim just says, oh, everything's fine, and the police walk away, of course the victim's going to say that.
Yeah, because
if they don't say that, then something dreadful will happen to them. So that's why we need to educate the police. There isn't mandatory training at the moment, and there absolutely needs to be, because victims shouldn't be knocking on the police's door going, please help me, please help me, please help me, multiple times before they even listen. That's what happens right now. legislation needs to change. So there's a domestic abuse bill. In fact, the reading is happening right now as we're doing this. So there needs to be a law, which is what they are talking about, which is domestic abuse. So believe it or not, domestic abuse isn't actually legislatively against the law. So what the police have to do is to find, you know, if they have a perpetrator, they have to find something against the law that the perpetrator's done. For example, an assault or a GBH. That's not domestic abuse. Domestic abuse isn't an incident at a time, but that's how the law treats it. And that's why it's very hard legally to prosecute domestic abuse, because they have, you know, you could have 20 years and they might find one incident and charge it as GBH.
Yeah.
So that's what's wrong with the system. So that desperately needs to change. And also we as a society and as a government and as a system use sticking plasters far too much. We need to look at prevention. We need to help young people. We need to not demonize young people or young offenders that are perpetrating behaviors that they've experienced as victims as children. We need to look at young children that are playing truancy, you know, that are expelled from school, because often it comes from, they don't just do things like that. Children don't just behave like that way. They behave like that from a deep place of unhappiness and fear, which ultimately tends to come from the home.
So what can we do right now if someone thinks they're in a position where they're suffering abuse, or they see someone they think is suffering abuse? What can they do? What resources are available to them right now?
Well, 100% speak out, because again, I think, you know, we talked about the society approach. I really believe in that, because I think still we
talk about it, get it out there.
Yeah, because I think still we go, should we say anything? Don't want to rock the boat. What if I'm wrong? Or it is just, you know, it's a personal issue. Like, we still kind of say those things.
He's
Rubbish.
Just a teenager he's going through. It's a phase.
Yeah. Get that out of your head. Get that out of your head. Say something. Because what's the worst that can happen if you say something? What's the worst that can happen if you don't? That's what you need to really weigh up. So definitely speak out, say something. Don't just ignore it. It's ignorance and ignoring it that is allowing this to happen right in front of our noses. So if there's a dangerous situation, an urgent situation, 100% phone 999. And if you can't speak, you can phone 999, wait for the phone to answer, and then you can press 55. And that means that the operators on the other end understand that you can't speak and you're in an urgent situation. So
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, yeah.
So even though I still think a lot of work needs to be done with the police, still use them though, because they are there in an urgent emergency. So phone them. But there are also helplines where you can get advice. You can be anonymous. There's various different helplines for victims of male abuse, for victims of female abuse. There's LGBT phone lines. You know, there's a national helpline, so there are people that you can phone. Also, if you suspect there's a situation with a child, you can phone the NSPCC helpline as well, and they will support you as well. And also remember, you can be anonymous, and then you will get access to multiple different agencies that will try and their best to support you. But also, if you're in a situation, the main thing is make sure you're okay, because you know the perpetrator, so you know what will keep yourself safe. So it's really important that you plan and you really think things through, and you know, you do everything to protect yourself.
Charlie Webster, it's been fantastic talking to you. I know it sounds wrong to say it's been fantastic talking to you about something so awful, but it has been really good to talk to you and to pick up on your passion for this, and all the best with the campaign and everything that's going on, and all the best with the podcast, which is a terrific, it's a really brave thing to do, but
thank you.
Thanks for doing it. It's an amazing thing. Where can we get Undiscussable, the podcast from Charlie Webster?
Everywhere.
just fun. So it's on the iTunes thing, it's on Stitcher, and it's on all the platforms.
We got it on everything. It's
got it
all,
out there.
Yeah, it's on all podcast platforms. All you got to do is search Undiscussable. If you can't find it, just go to my website, which is just my name, charliewebster.com, and there's a section, a page that says Undiscussable. Click that. It has all the information on it. It has resources on it. It has all our written notes, and it also has every piece of audio as well. So yeah, I mean, thank you, and hope you have a listen. And also just to note that it is, some bits can be quite upsetting, so there's a bit of a trigger warning with it. So take your time. You know, if you have experienced it and you are a survivor, take your time going through it, and yeah, recognize that it might trigger you.
Once again, the podcast is called Undiscussable, and it's Charlie Webster. Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you.